The scorching August sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty town square of Silver Creek, Arizona Territory, in the summer of 1884. A crowd had gathered around the makeshift auction platform erected in front of the territorial courthouse, their voices creating a low murmur of anticipation and greed. Today was the monthly livestock and property auction, where fortunes were made and lost with the swing of an auctioneer's hammer. Jake Iron Horse Morrison stood at the edge of the crowd, his weathered hands resting on the pommel of his Colt .45. At 35, he was a man carved from the harsh landscape itself, tall, lean, with sun-darkened skin and steel-gray eyes that had seen too much violence and too little mercy. His reputation as a horse-breaker was legendary throughout the territory, but it was his skill with a gun that kept men respectful and women intrigued. Jake had ridden into Silver Creek with one purpose: to buy Thunder's Pride, a magnificent black stallion that had been the talk of every ranch from here to California. The horse was said to be unbreakable, a wild spirit that had thrown every cowboy foolish enough to try mounting him. But Jake had never met a horse he couldn't tame, and he needed a mount worthy of his reputation. "Ladies and gentlemen," bellowed Silas Crow, the auctioneer, a portly man with a voice that could carry across 3 counties. "We come now to the crown jewel of today's auction, Thunder's Pride, the finest stallion this side of the Mississippi." The crowd pressed forward as 4 men struggled to lead the magnificent black horse onto the platform. Thunder's Pride reared and snorted, his eyes wild with fury, his powerful muscles rippling beneath his midnight coat. Even restrained, the animal radiated a dangerous beauty that made hardened cowboys step back in respect and fear. "Bidding starts at $50. Crow announced. "75, called out Bartholomew Ashford, the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties. Ashford was a man who collected beautiful things, horses, cattle, and women, with equal passion and ruthlessness. "100, shouted another voice. Jake remained silent, studying the horse with a professional eye. Thunder's Pride was indeed magnificent, but something else had caught his attention. Standing in the shadows beside the platform was a young woman, perhaps 22 or 23, with auburn hair that caught the sunlight like burnished copper. She wore a simple brown dress that had seen better days, but her posture was proud, her green eyes fixed on the stallion with an intensity that matched the animal's own wild spirit. 150. Ashford's voice boomed across the square. The woman stepped forward suddenly, her voice cutting through the crowd's noise like a blade. "Please, Mr. Ashford, don't buy Thunder's Pride." The crowd turned to stare at her, and Jake found himself moving closer, intrigued by her desperate plea. Ashford's cold blue eyes fixed on the woman with obvious displeasure. "Miss O'Brien, you have no business interfering with this auction. Your father's debts are what put that horse on the block in the first place." So this was Seamus O'Brien's daughter. Jake had heard the story. The Irish horse trainer had died in a riding accident 3 months ago, leaving behind massive gambling debts and a daughter with no means to pay them. Everything O'Brien had owned was being sold to satisfy his creditors. "I know that, sir," the woman, Miss O'Brien, replied, her voice steady despite the tremor Jake could detect beneath her words. "But Thunder's Pride isn't just any horse. He was my father's pride and joy, and he's dangerous. He's already injured 3 men who tried to ride him." "That's precisely why I want him," Ashford said with a cruel smile. "I enjoy breaking things that think they can't be broken." Jake saw the woman flinch at those words, and something cold settled in his chest. He'd heard rumors about Ashford's treatment of his horses, and his women. $200. Ashford called out, his eyes never leaving Miss O'Brien's face. The woman looked around desperately, her gaze sweeping over the crowd until it landed on Jake. For a moment their eyes met, and he saw something in her green depths that hit him like a physical blow. Not just desperation, but a fierce, untamed spirit that reminded him of the stallion itself. Then she did something that shocked everyone present. She stepped onto the auction platform. "Mr. Crow," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent square. "I'd like to make a counter-proposal." The auctioneer looked confused. "Miss, you can't bid on your own father's property. You don't have any money." "I'm not bidding on Thunder's Pride," she said, lifting her chin with a pride that made Jake's chest tighten. "I'm offering myself instead." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Ashford's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. "What exactly are you proposing, Miss O'Brien?" Crow asked, clearly out of his depth. The woman, Jake realized he still didn't know her first name, took a deep breath. "I'm proposing that instead of buying Thunder's Pride, someone could employ me. As a housekeeper, a cook, whatever is needed. I know horses better than any man here, and I can work off my father's debts." Interesting, Ashford purred, stepping closer to the platform. And what would be the terms of this employment? Jake saw the way Ashford looked at her, and his hand instinctively moved toward his gun. He'd seen that look before, and it never meant anything good for the woman involved. Miss O'Brien faltered for the first time, clearly not having thought through the implications of her desperate offer. I'll tell you what, Ashford continued, his voice carrying a predatory satisfaction. I'll take both. The horse and you. Consider it a package deal. No. The word tore from Miss O'Brien's throat. That's not what I meant. But Ashford was already reaching for his wallet. $300 for the horse, and I'll assume responsibility for Miss O'Brien's employment. Jake had heard enough. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a whip crack. $500. Every head turned toward him. Ashford's face darkened with anger. $500 for the horse, Morrison? That's a lot of money for a man who lives out of his saddlebags. Jake's eyes never left Miss O'Brien's face as he spoke. Not for the horse, Ashford. For the lady. The silence that followed was deafening. Miss O'Brien stared at him with wide eyes, her lips parted in shock. You can't be serious, Ashford snarled. Dead serious, Jake replied, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. $500 to pay off her father's debts, and Miss O'Brien comes with me. As my employee. Miss O'Brien found her voice. Sir, I don't even know your name. Jake Morrison, he said simply. And I'm offering you a choice, which is more than Ashford would do. She looked between the two men, Ashford with his cruel smile and obvious intentions, and this stranger with the steel-gray eyes who had just offered her an escape she hadn't dared hope for. What kind of employment? She asked quietly. Jake's voice was steady, but there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Whatever kind you're willing to give, miss? Kathleen, she whispered. Kathleen O'Brien. Well, Miss Kathleen O'Brien, Jake said, pulling out a leather pouch heavy with coins. Do we have a deal? Kathleen looked at Thunder's Pride, still fighting his restraints, then back at Jake Morrison. In that moment she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Don't buy the Stallion, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. Buy me, Cowboy. I'll ride only for you forever. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs, but Jake only had eyes for the brave, desperate woman who had just placed her fate in his hands. Ashford's face was purple with rage. This is preposterous. You can't just. I can and I will, Jake said, counting out the money. Unless you want to make this a different kind of contest, Ashford. The threat was clear, and Ashford, for all his wealth and influence, was no gunfighter. He stepped back, his eyes promising future trouble. As Jake handed over the money and Kathleen stepped down from the platform, neither of them noticed the way Thunder's pride had calmed, as if sensing that his fate was somehow tied to theirs. The auction continued, but the real drama was just beginning. Jake Morrison had bought himself more than an employee. He'd bought a mystery, a challenge, and possibly the one thing that could either save his soul or destroy it completely. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when Jake Morrison led Kathleen O'Brien away from the auction square. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Ranger, stood patiently at the hitching post outside Murphy's saloon, saddlebags packed and ready for the trail. Kathleen walked beside him in silence, her few possessions, a worn carpet bag and her father's old saddle, clutched tightly in her hands. The reality of what she had just done was beginning to sink in, and with it came a mixture of relief and terror that made her stomach churn. Where are we going? She asked as Jake secured her belongings to his pack horse. My spread is about 20 miles north of here, up in the foothills, he replied, checking the cinch on Ranger's saddle. It's not much to look at, but it's honest land. Kathleen nodded, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. And what exactly will my duties be? Jake paused in his preparations and looked at her directly. In the fading afternoon light, his gray eyes seemed almost silver. That depends on you, Miss O'Brien. I told you I was offering you a choice and I meant it. But you paid $500 for me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Surely you expect something in return. Jake's expression softened slightly. I expect honest work for honest pay. Nothing more, nothing less. Unless. He trailed off, then shook his head. We'll figure it out as we go. Before Kathleen could ask what he'd been about to say, a commotion erupted from the direction of the auction square. Shouts and the sound of splintering wood echoed through the streets, followed by the thunder of hooves. Thunder's Pride, Kathleen breathed, recognizing the sound. He's broken free. They turned to see the magnificent black stallion come charging down Main Street, his eyes wild with fury and freedom. Behind him ran a group of men, including Bartholomew Ashford, all shouting and waving ropes. "Get out of the way," someone yelled as the stallion bore down on them. But instead of diving for cover, Kathleen stepped into the street. "Thunder," she called, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Thunder, easy boy." The stallion skidded to a halt just feet from her, his sides heaving, his nostrils flared. For a moment the entire street held its breath. "That's it," Kathleen murmured, slowly extending her hand. "Remember me, boy? Remember Kathleen?" Thunder's pride snorted and tossed his head, but he didn't bolt. Instead he took a tentative step toward her, then another. Jake watched in amazement as the supposedly unbreakable horse allowed Kathleen to touch his muzzle, then his neck. The animal that had terrorized every man who tried to handle him was as gentle as a lamb under her touch. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered Murphy, the saloon owner, who had come out to watch the spectacle. Ashford and his men arrived, breathing hard and looking frustrated. "Stand back, Miss O'Brien," Ashford commanded. "That animal is dangerous." "Not to me," Kathleen replied, her hand still stroking Thunder's neck. "He knows me. I helped train him from a colt." "Then you can help us get him back to the corral," Ashford said, reaching for a rope. "No." The word came from Jake, who had moved to stand beside Kathleen. "The horse made his choice just like the lady did." Ashford's face darkened. "That horse belongs to me now, Morrison. I paid for him." "Did you?" Jake asked mildly. "Because from where I stand, it looks like he's choosing his own path." As if to emphasize the point, Thunder's pride moved closer to Kathleen, positioning himself between her and Ashford's men. "This is ridiculous," Ashford snarled. "Sheriff, arrest this man for horse theft." But Sheriff Tom Bradley, who had been watching from the boardwalk, shook his head. "Can't arrest a man for standing in the street, Bart." And technically the horse came to them. Jake saw an opportunity and took it. "Tell you what, Ashford. I'll buy the horse from you. Same price you paid, $200. The horse is worth twice that." "Maybe to someone who can handle him," Jake replied. "But what good is a horse that won't let you near him?" Ashford looked at Thunder's pride, who was now nuzzling Kathleen's shoulder with obvious affection, and his expression grew calculating. 300. Final offer. Jake nodded and counted out the additional money. "Deal." As the transaction was completed, Kathleen looked up at Jake with wonder. "Why did you do that?" "Because," Jake said, taking Thunder's pride's makeshift halter from her hands, "it seemed like the right thing to do. Besides, something tells me this horse and I are going to understand each other just fine." Thunder's pride snorted and tossed his head, but he didn't pull away when Jake took the lead rope. "We should get moving," Jake said, glancing at the darkening sky. "It's a long ride and I'd rather not be on the trail after full dark." Kathleen nodded, but as they prepared to leave, she turned back for one last look at Silver Creek. It had been her home for 23 years, but now it felt like a prison she was finally escaping. "Any regrets?" Jake asked, following her gaze. "No," she said, and was surprised to realize she meant it. No regrets. The ride to Jake's ranch took them through some of the most beautiful country Kathleen had ever seen. They climbed steadily into the foothills, following a winding trail that led through stands of pine and aspen, past crystal-clear streams and meadows carpeted with wildflowers. Jake had fashioned a lead rope for Thunder's pride, but the stallion followed willingly, seeming to understand that his fate was now tied to theirs. Kathleen rode her father's old mare, a gentle sorrel named Rosie who had been too old and worn to interest any bidders at the auction. As they rode, Jake found himself stealing glances at his unexpected companion. Kathleen O'Brien was unlike any woman he'd ever known. She sat her horse with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, and she handled the rough trail without complaint. But it was more than that. There was a strength in her, a resilience that reminded him of the wild country they were traveling through. "Tell me about your ranch," Kathleen said as they paused to water the horses at a mountain stream. "It's not much," Jake replied, loosening Ranger's cinch. "About 1,000 acres of good grazing land, a small cabin, and a barn that's seen better days. I've been working it alone for the past 3 years." "What happened 3 years ago?" Jake's expression darkened. "That's when I decided I'd had enough of other people's wars and other people's rules. I was a cavalry scout before that, spent most of my time tracking Apache and keeping settlers alive." "And you gave that up to become a rancher?" "I gave it up to become human again," Jake said quietly. "There's only so much killing a man can do before it starts to eat away at his soul." Kathleen studied his profile as he knelt by the stream to fill their water bottles. There was pain in his past, she could see that clearly. But there was also a fundamental decency that had made him step in when Ashford would have claimed her like a piece of property. "What about you?" Jake asked, straightening up. "What's your story, Miss O'Brien?" "Kathleen," she corrected. "And there's not much to tell. My mother died when I was 12, so I grew up helping my father with his horses. He was a good trainer, but—" She sighed. "He had a weakness for cards and whiskey. The debts just kept piling up. And now you're stuck with a stranger who bought you like a prize heifer," Jake said, his voice bitter with self-recrimination. "No," Kathleen said firmly. "Now I'm free for the first time in my life. You gave me a choice, Jake Morrison. That's more than anyone else has done in a very long time." Their eyes met across the stream, and something passed between them. An understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of something deeper. Thunder's pride chose that moment to splash into the stream, sending water flying and breaking the spell. Both Jake and Kathleen laughed, and the tension that had been building between them eased. "We should keep moving," Jake said, but his voice was warmer now. "We'll reach the ranch just after sunset if we push hard." As they remounted and continued up the trail, neither of them noticed the rider following at a distance, staying just out of sight among the trees. Thomas Ashford, Bartholomew's eldest son, had been tracking them since they left Silver Creek, and the expression on his face promised trouble ahead. The sun was painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson when they finally crested the last ridge and Jake's ranch spread out below them. It was, as he had said, not much to look at: a small log cabin with a stone chimney, a weathered barn, and several corrals surrounded by rolling grassland. But to Kathleen, who had spent the last 3 months wondering where she would sleep each night, it looked like paradise. "Welcome to the Broken Spur Ranch," Jake said, and there was pride in his voice despite his earlier modest words. "It's beautiful," Kathleen breathed and meant it. As they rode down toward the cabin, Thunder's pride suddenly raised his head and whinnied. From the corral came an answering call, and Kathleen saw several horses moving restlessly in the gathering dusk. "Looks like Thunder's already making friends," Jake observed. "He's a social animal," Kathleen said. "Horses need companionship as much as people do." Jake glanced at her. "Is that your professional opinion or personal experience?" "Both," she admitted. They were almost to the cabin when Thunder's pride suddenly shied, nearly pulling the lead rope from Jake's hands. The stallion's ears were pricked forward, his nostrils flaring as he tested the wind. "What is it, boy?" Kathleen asked, but she was already reaching for the rifle her father had taught her to use. Jake's hand moved to his Colt. "Someone's here," he said quietly. "Someone who doesn't belong." A figure stepped out from behind the barn, and Jake cursed under his breath. It was Thomas Ashford, and he wasn't alone. 2 other men emerged from the shadows, their hands resting on their gun butts. "Well, well," Thomas called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Look what we have here. The famous Jake Morrison and his new employee." Jake dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. "This is private property, Ashford. You're not welcome here." "Oh, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Thomas replied, his smile cold and predatory. "You see, my father sent me to collect what belongs to us." "I paid for everything fair and square," Jake said. "You've got no claim here." "Don't we?" Thomas's smile widened. "That horse was stolen from our corral. And as for the woman—" His eyes fixed on Kathleen with obvious hunger. "Well, let's just say my father has decided he wants to renegotiate that particular transaction." Kathleen felt ice form in her stomach, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm not property to be bought and sold." "Aren't you?" Thomas laughed. "You put yourself on the auction block, sweetheart. That makes you fair game." Jake stepped forward, his hand now openly resting on his gun. "The lady's under my protection now. That means anyone who wants to hurt her has to go through me first." "Is that a challenge, Morrison?" "It's a promise." The tension stretched taut between the two groups, and Kathleen realized that her desperate bid for freedom had set in motion events that could end in bloodshed. But as she looked at Jake Morrison, this stranger who had risked everything to give her a choice, she knew that whatever came next she would face it standing beside him. Thunder's pride stamped and snorted as if sensing the coming storm. And in the gathering darkness of the mountain evening, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just Kathleen's fate, but the future of everyone involved.